So let's move on to the second half of this essay, moving into body paragraph 2, looking at the disadvantages. Now, it's pretty clear that there is a sense of contrast between body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2. We can emphasize that contrast by starting with an appropriate cohesive device. You could say, on the other hand, you could say, however, I'm going to use the expression nevertheless, but the important thing here is to try to create a sense of transition between the first paragraph, the first body paragraph, and the second body paragraph. You should try to create a sense of transition between all of the paragraphs. It's important not just to transition smoothly between sentences, but also over the essay as a whole, and that means between paragraphs as well. And we do that here. We've talked about all this good stuff. We say, nevertheless, we also need to consider some of the bad stuff as well. That's all about coherence and cohesion. And you can learn more about that, particularly in the Task 2 course, and words like nevertheless in a lecture on cohesive devices. Okay, let's move on. Nevertheless, and all I want to say here is that there are some problems as well. Problems about what? Again, we want to reference the task itself, so we will do that with a gerund. Assessing students via examinations does present some problems. An interesting thing I've done here is to use the auxiliary do, the verb do, in this form does. We would do this when we want to emphasize a particular verb, particularly when we want to emphasize the contrast. You can imagine saying it something like, here is all the good stuff. Firstly, secondly, finally. Amazing, all this good stuff. However, we do need to consider some problems as well. Not we need to consider, but we do need to. It just helps to emphasize that there's a strong sense of contrast here, to emphasize the verb that follows it as well. So nevertheless, assessing students via examinations does present some problems. You can almost hear it in the inner voice in your head. Okay, starting with an example, which is actually our main point, but the point here is that again we're using an appropriate cohesive device. For instance, for example, to illustrate, we'll go with for instance here. Now down in my plan I can see pressure harms performance. Brighter students perform poorly. I want to bring in both of those ideas into this second sentence. We want to make the point that students, whoever they are, can be affected by pressure. And then in the third sentence, we'll talk about exams and their influence there. So we'll say something like, some students are extremely, I'm not going to use the word bright because I want to use that later. So we'll say something like intelligent and creative. Some students are extremely intelligent and creative, but what? But when put under pressure. Lovely collocation here, put under pressure. So when put under pressure, and imagine you've got this when they are put under pressure, but you don't actually need that, you can omit that from the sentence. But when put under pressure, their minds, here's another really nice collocation, their minds can go blank, which is what happens when it feels like your brain is just emptied of content and knowledge. When you're looking at your exam paper and the task in front of you and you just can't think of anything. That's what happens when your mind goes blank, and that happens a lot when people are under pressure. Now, considering that exams are very high pressure situations, in fact, that's a perfect way to start the next sentence. Considering that exams, I'll just switch it up a little bit in the order, are situations of intensely, because I used extremely here, intensely high pressure. That's a real problem, isn't it? Because it's going to cause a lot of students' minds to go blank. We'll use a really nice expression here. It is no wonder that, which is like saying it is not surprising that. So considering exams are situations of intensely high pressure, it is no wonder that even the, and here we go down here, the brightest of students sometimes perform poorly. Notice that I'm avoiding generalizations throughout here. We've got some students, not all students. Their minds can go blank, they don't always go blank. and even the brightest of students sometimes, not always, perform poorly. Okay, let's move on into the fourth sentence. We're looking at another problem, another example of a problem. So we'll use the word another. Another significant disadvantage. And it's really easy for me to think of synonyms for crucial. You know, we had crucial up here, now we're using significant. And in the vocabulary exercise that you will have a look at after this lecture, you'll see that I've got a little trick for you that you can use to quickly think of synonyms in this regard as well. So another significant advantage of this system, so this approach, this system would be a way of paraphrasing, of this system is, you can see this here, is the narrow range of information which students are tested on. So you are tested on information when you are doing an exam. Now that is very different to continual assessment. In this paragraph so far, we haven't provided any reference to continual assessment. There is not that sense of context that we had earlier that improved this paragraph. So we're going to add it here. And a way of, again, got this idea of a contrast here, alternative, we can open it with the word unlike. But then we'll follow it with more information about exams. So unlike with continual assessment. So if you start with unlike and then the noun of choice, you do not look at an example of that thing. You continue to look at an example of the previous thing. So in this case, exams. So unlike, the key is in the word there, unlike with continual assessment, let's say the small window of time, a nice collocation, the small window of time in tests, in exams, limits how many questions can be asked. And that's not really full testing, is it? So we can say thus or therefore. So this follows that, it follows that. They are not testing students' knowledge in full. There's the word full at the end there. Okay, so unlike with continual assessment, which does have a large window of time, unlike with continual assessment, the small window of time in tests limits how many questions can be asked, thus not testing students' knowledge in full. We could even say something like thus failing to test students' knowledge in full, so we can avoid the negation. Okay, we provide that context at the end there as well, so we've fulfilled that requirement. Let's have a look at the word count. We're at 228. That's a great number to finish on when it comes to the second body paragraph. It means we don't have to worry about creating a lengthy conclusion, but it also means that we've saved plenty of time as the word count isn't so high. When it comes to the conclusion, I always recommend in conclusion to start things off. Every single essay in this course, each conclusion will start in the same way, in conclusion. For IELTS at least, there really is no need to memorize anything else. You can do, there's no problem with doing so, but in conclusion is all that you need when it comes to a conclusion. In conclusion. Now, the best thing here is to finish by demonstrating your quality and range of grammar. And you can do that by finishing the essay with a single sentence, a single complex sentence. So everything that we have in this conclusion will be formed of a single sentence. And to have a complex sentence, you need something called a subordinating conjunction, which will link a dependent clause with an independent clause. If that sounds a bit like gibbery-jew to you, no idea, then please check out the lecture in the Task 2 course on complex sentences, which is in the grammar section. Now, a subordinating conjunction is a word like although. It creates a sense of contrast where we can link through contrast a dependent clause with an independent clause. We're going to start with the dependent clause. Although formal examinations, which are what we're looking at here, although formal examinations are beneficial, how? What are they beneficial for? How are they beneficial? This is where we summarize the content in terms of let's summarize but paraphrase at the same time. We've got cheating, leave a little room for cheating. Let's say something like cutting out cheating. And what was the other advantage that we talked about? It was about time efficiency, time efficient. So let's say improving efficiency. That's the end of the dependent clause. When you reach the end of the dependent clause, you add a comma. Then you move to the independent clause, and this is where you look at a summary of the second body paragraph. We can say something like this. It is important to consider, so here are all these amazing things, but it is also important to consider that they also, because I didn't write also here, it is important to consider that they also, let's paraphrase again, what have we got here? Let's say something like harm some, not all, some students' concentration. Notice where the apostrophe is here. I'm not looking this is plural, so that when we have a possessive of a plural, the apostrophe comes after the plural s. Some students' concentration. And what was the other point? It was about the range of information and not testing students' knowledge in full. So let's go with something like and are, again, avoid the generalization. We'll say are arguably not. In here, we've got an opportunity to make one last comparison. We can also reference continual assessment as well by using a negative comparative. Again, this is actually something you can learn a bit about in my Task 1 course about comparatives. Very useful when talking about comparative graphs. Now, to make a negative comparative, we use not plus as plus an adjective plus as followed by what you're comparing something with. So we just now need to find an appropriate adjective. Full? No, that doesn't work. Not as full. It doesn't make sense. It works here, but it certainly doesn't work here. I wonder if you can work out what I'm going to write here. Thorough. And be careful with the spelling of this word. A lot of people mistake it with the word through or thought, things like this. Also notice the pronunciation is very different to those words as well. Thorough. It's not as thorough as continual assessments. We can look at the word count here and we can see a count of 265. Really nice count, only 15 words over, plenty of time to go back and check for errors. I just want to make one more comment about that conclusion. I want you to notice how the conclusion doesn't just say, although there are some good points to formal examinations, there are also some bad points as well. It doesn't just say good points, bad points, advantages, disadvantages. It actually summarizes the content as well. It says what those advantages and disadvantages that we talked about actually are, and it attempts to paraphrase at the same time. If you are struggling for time, of course, you may need to be quite selective with your language. You may need to just use the same language again, but it's really important for me, I believe, really to kind of push for that band 9 in terms of task response to actually summarize the content, show your ability to remind the reader of the content that they have read and the arguments that you have made. Okay, so before we close, just a quick review on this first lecture here. What we've looked at is a discussion essay. We've looked at the basic structure of an essay that involves a discussion. So we want to look at both sides. It's a requirement to look at both sides. We want to look at more than one advantage, more than one disadvantage, because that's part of the task requirements as well. So you can start with the advantages, move to the disadvantages. You can do it the other way around as well. It really doesn't matter. And we've also looked at generally how to build a body paragraph when looking at an essay like this. So you make a point, you develop the point with a supporting point, with an example, with a result, with an alternative, whatever the case. Don't just make points and leave them. You need to develop your ideas, and this lecture has been designed in a way to show you how you can do that. Now, after this lecture, you will see that there is a document for you to download, and this document is a list of vocabulary exercises. This list of vocabulary exercises is just sentences that have been taken from this essay which contain high-scoring language, and the sentences and stretches of language have a missing word, and it is your job to identify the missing word from what you can remember from the essay. Like I say, I have specifically selected this language because I think it's important language for you to learn. It's a mixture of language related to the topic, so topic related vocabulary. It's also some useful cohesive language, so some cohesive devices might appear in there, and also language that can be useful in many different types of essays as well, so just generally useful academic vocabulary. There is an exercise like this at the end of every single essay in this course. So overall, you're looking at 100 different exercises by the time that you finish. But of course, if you have any questions about those exercises, do get in touch. I hope you found this essay useful, and I will see you in the next lecture.